What's up, guys? Welcome back to Christian Man Reviews. Jubilee just dropped another video, actually one that caught my attention. It's 25 Christians versus one atheist. The one atheist being Alex O'Connor, who l- I believe really wants to believe it. He says this throughout the video, so I'll leave it linked in the description. But he asked this question: suffering makes God's existence unlikely. And I see where he's come from, but I disagree with the premise. But this is an angle that I never considered taking it from. And let's see what this young man has to say to Alex and how Alex responds to it.
Good luck. How's it, man?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous, or
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God.
So let's hear, what kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative, and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at the total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, hold on, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
So are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Okay, because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bring back to life, and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I ask, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence. They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that...
So let's pause there. If you really want to get the rest of it, I want to encourage you to go on, click the link below, check out the rest of their video. But what this young man was trying to provide Alex was a different perspective, saying that, hey, we shouldn't judge on what's happening, but what happens after, hinting at the afterlife. And what he's touching on is Alex is assuming that all because of the suffering is bad, and that these animals who are not sentient like we are can't make the same decisions and learn from the suffering and persevere through it and grow from it and have this character development. And he makes the reference to a child at the beginning of a book as an illustration of, hey, this child got leukemia, died in the first few moments of the book, not as a reference to the rest of the story, but just why does that child have to suffer? And I believe the scriptures give us a couple of answers on why that is, and I want to show you some scriptures to share those thoughts. First one being in Genesis chapter 3, where we take a look at the fall and what happens after. So if we pick up here, we see in verse 17, Adam's blaming Eve for listening to Satan, them eating the fruit, and them recognizing their nakedness. And what ends up happening is in verse 21 says, the Lord made garments of skin out of Adam for his wife and his clothes. And the Lord said to them, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach his hand and also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So they were banished from that. But you got to ask yourselves, okay, where did this skin come from? Well, we know that in the prior chapters, Adam was naming the animals, and there's animals in the Garden of Eden, animals on earth. And so God made a sacrifice to help the humans once they've recognized good and evil. And so we see that there initially was not meant to be this suffering. Like we were all supposed to be, there was supposed to be perfect peace. There was supposed to be this balance. And another example of that we can look at is in Isaiah. And so here in Isaiah 11, we see that there is a prophecy of Jesus. Talk about a shoot springing from the root of Jesse, the spirit of wisdom, understanding, spirit of counsel, might, spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord, and that he'll delight in the fear of the Lord. But we see here what God actually wanted with all the animals. And for us, it says, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, and the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and the little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, and the young will lie down together, and the lamb will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand in the viper's nest. There will neither harm nor destroy on all his holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, and the water covers the sea. And so ultimately, what God wanted was for all of us to be at peace. But when came the fall, the balance was disrupted, and the consequences of our actions were brought on all of us all together. Is that fair? That's not for me to judge. But what we can see is like, hey, when we look at all of it, God never intended for us to be at odds with each other. If you look at, if you go back to Genesis, you also see that God never the original intent was for us to be vegetarians, just to eat the vegetables of the land. There wasn't any need to kill the animals because we were going to have enough to eat in the garden. And once again, you see after the fall, you have Cain raising the you see Cain raising, I mean, being a farmer. You see Abel being a shepherd, and it makes all the difference. And so, because of what was needed, because of learning how to grow, because of the change of what we did and the actions, God gave us the natural consequences of action that Adam and Eve brought to us. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is what Alex was talking about with the child. And this takes me to the book of Ecclesiastes. Yes, and they had no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressor, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who was never born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. And this is King Solomon writing. And the concept can still also be applied to young children, where there's not much that they remember. And if they die young, though it is sad, they don't have to go through the pains that is growing, the pains that is experiencing the negative impacts that it happens in the world around us. And I've seen people lose their kids, and it is a terrible, terrible thing. But for us as believers, we have that peace knowing that, hey, they're up there with God, and that they're in a place where there is no pain, there is no more tears, there is no more cries, and they're with the perfect father, better than the parent that we could be. And in fact, it gives us sometimes motivation to strive after walking with God more closely so we can be up there with him. And so though these things seem evil, and though sometimes the suffering to the animals, the suffering to people, the suffering to children seems unnecessary, we can't see the bigger picture. There's a lot of times we think we know and we understand something, and then we find out more information and we realize, oh man, I had it completely wrong. And so I want to encourage you guys to think about this. Hey, maybe there's something in my life that I'm just not understanding, and I just got to trust God with it. And once you take that leap of trust, then God will make it clear and help you to understand. So tell me what you think. Make sure to go and check out the full video. Share your thoughts, and I'll see you guys next time.